We've just relocated. We're in Muizenberg now, which is it's a sign of retirement, I suppose, when you come back to Cape Town. Well, I started in standards. Actually, I did Sub A and Sub B and disliked it intensely. I mean, I clearly wasn't happy. My mother took me out, um, which I'm very, very pleased about. And I went to Michael Oak, which is a Waldorf school. It was a little Waldorf school that later my mother ended up teaching at. And so I did the standard 1 to 5 there. And I was terrified at the prospect of going to, a big real school. Because much as I had enjoyed being at Michael Oak, I thought, like my friends said, well, they do mathematics. I thought, my goodness, I haven't done mathematics. And then they'd say, well, they've done, I can't remember, but various things. Geometry, have you ever done, and I thought, I don't know any of these things. What am I going to do? And at my school, you called people Mr. So-and-so or Mr. So-and-so. And at this other school, you call people sir, So I was pretty kind of anxious. And I discovered in the first few weeks that I knew all of those things and better, that the Michael Oak education didn't use the same names, but that I was on top of everything. And I think I learned to say sir, but always with reservation. And actually, I think I was just having a conversation with Adele, my wife, this morning because my feeling, I wasn't going to participate in this. I'm doing the speech at the dinner, and I thought, well, once is enough. But that's not really going to be about the school. And but your email intrigued me, when you said that it's taken off and it's been so. And I thought, now what the hell? I mean, SACS. I didn't like SACS. I thought it was a really bad school. I was unhappy with the whole institution and with the teaching, and I can say more about that later. So my story isn't really like a story of going from standard 6 to I don't really have a linear story to tell, but except that I think fairly early on I learned to disrespect the authority that I was presented with. And I actually suspect that a lot of that came from Michael Oak and the way we were taught there, much smaller classes, much more personal interaction with teachers, and a very creative, exploratory education. You didn't sit in the classroom learning about how, let's say, uh, how people built houses out of sticks and mud. You actually went and built one in the garden, like as a class. And you went through it, and then you'd go to the museum, and that was a very active kind of learning process. And it taught us to think, I think. And so so it's difficult to exactly kind of date it or put, but it, as I say, I very rapidly felt that the teachers I was just bored stiff actually through most classes. I was talking to Dave Atwell. I mean, I wasn't close to him ever at that time. I think he was a sports person and I wasn't. And I was having this conversation with him, and we both sort of we agreed that we could barely think of a teacher who we would call inspiring. There's no particular teacher there were some I was intrigued by. A guy called Jones who taught science for a couple of years. De Kock who taught biology, who was a very odd chap, but I kind of enjoyed him. And that was really because I enjoyed biology and I enjoyed science. I was very, very immersed in those subjects. But that was because of my own interests outside of school. I loved English, but apart from a guy called Schroeder, I think, in Standard 6, I can't remember anyone who made, who I can remember the teachers, but I wasn't inspired by them. I mean, so there was this real kind of sense of an institution that was riding on a kind of sense of itself, which rang hollow to me. I suppose it started with Whiteford. This sort of he kind of epitomized. He had such. I suppose my sense of him is that he believed he epitomized the great values of this extraordinary institution, which is modeled on a British public school, which is obviously the opposite of a public school here. It's a private school. So, that kind of Oxonian tradition. And he's a Latin scholar, and he was remote, and he had his eccentricities, which you must have to be an Oxonian. And then, of course, there was his routine around giving you cuts. And I just remember that so clearly. You had to come in and try and explain yourself and give some sort of excuse for why something had happened. And then he'd close the door, and then you knew you were going to have cuts. And then you had to go over and get the stick, and then he'd point to somewhere on the carpet where you had to stand, and then he'd say, "No, move over." And then this whole bloody ritual around caning. There was a bit of a discussion on the emails at one point about the caning. I mean, it's not that I had a huge number. I mean, I had enough, I suppose. But I came out. It gave me an adrenaline rush because I came out and I just sort of thought, well, fuck you. I'm not going to make a noise. I'm not going to flinch. I'm just going to. And I suppose that was generally the way you were supposed to do it. And that was. I mean, I wonder if someone had really sort of flouted that and just sort of maybe burst into tears or said, "Well, I'm not bending." I don't know, something. I didn't do that. I wasn't bold enough. And then you had to walk out like with your ass burning and sort of look like you were totally cool with it, and walk past the queue of people who would all be looking at you to see like what happened. And then you get around the corner, you can sort of jump and say, and it's just that whole kind of display of authority and power. I mean, I just, is just obnoxious, terrible. And I think I had that, there was Doug Brown, who I think was probably, he was a teacher who could have inspired one in English. And maybe there were moments where he did, but I found so, I can't think of the right word, but so sort of off-putting his obsession with the length of your hair. And he's also, again, he's very kind of remote authoritarian vibe. So everything about the school, and I suppose maybe those who were in sports, who were sportsmen, would have had quite a different experience. I don't know because I wasn't one, but I was in the D team rugby, running around, throwing myself in the mud, but never really getting a grip on the ball. I played Masters League cricket, which was for all the kind of real people who couldn't play in real teams. You were also. And I enjoyed that, I think. And then when I took up surfing, Charlie Simpson persuaded me to try water polo, but I think I sank more than I swam. I just wasn't a powerful enough swimmer. So yeah, sports wasn't my thing, and I think that probably gives people a very different experience of school. And I've been in a team. I didn't feel I was part of a team really in anything. My friends were a lot of them were at SACS, but they were primarily friends from before or from outside. Kids who lived on the same street as me or whatever. So yeah, I've got a strange kind of that's why I was intrigued by your email, because it felt to me like, like the last thing I'd want to do would be to kind of remember warm memories of the old school. The last thing I would ever want to do would be to send my kids to SACS. But of course, SACS has changed a lot, and I'm sure it's changed in many ways for the better. I mean, I think many schools at that time were the same kind of thing, very authoritarian, very rigid, very inflexible, very rote learning out of textbooks that you had to memorize. And I just, that all of that just and Dave Atwell has got he also said that he made an interesting point. He said, he thought that by virtue of being so close to power, because I suppose it was an elite school, although it had people, from all walks of life and stuff. But it was an elite school in its sense of itself and its place in South Africa, and in the kind of the hierarchy of classes, the standard 9, Latin class, which is the scholars, and which is where I was. And this sort of sense of the hierarchy of trades, the hierarchy of professions, and the proximity to, in some or other way, to notions of political power. So one learns about power, and I mean, Dave was hazarding the thought that by virtue of being so close to power and authority, we learnt a lot about how power and authority works. Some of us to join the ranks of those in authority and in power, and others of us to resist, to critique, resist that kind of power and authority, which is where I ended up. And so I suppose that's my I mean that's my kind of that's my narrative about the school, which has sort of really only come to me. I mean, I've been mulling over, like, where's this conversation going to go? This is kind of intriguing because I wasn't expecting to be intrigued by by this kind of thing.
Me too.
As I say, I don't have fun. You weren't also. It is, and I mean, it's actually making me. So on the one hand, I describe my resistance to power and authority, and a skepticism about that. And I think I got off to an early start simply by virtue of this other education that I'd experienced, which just was very different in so many ways, in all ways. So that in a way I had a name for this power. I remember speaking to someone but anyway, so what I wanted to, in fact, I'll say some other things as well, but what I wanted to riff off what you were saying is that on the other side of the resistance is, as you say, exactly a comfort with power. And I mean, I think of that less during the apartheid years because I was very much on the other side, but I rapidly learned a comfort with the power of the other side, of my side, so to speak. And I'm thinking, so I've been in, oh God, I mean, I've interacted with ministers, I've been in the National Planning Commission, I've spent a lot of time with general secretaries of trade unions, all those powerful places. And I can feel, there's a way in which, so I don't think, I mean, I think initially I found all of that quite uncomfortable. Like, I don't think I was a super confident type of person at that point in those earlier days. But I very rapidly learned this kind of comfort, with being in places of power. So on the board of the post office, I was on the board of the post office from 1996 for 5 years or something. So you talk about boardrooms. I mean, all of those kinds of places. And I'm sure that a lot of that comes from the privilege or that SACS was part of being in that privileged space in a way that one didn't necessarily see. It wasn't visible. And I hadn't ever thought of that as a I mean, I suppose it's a mixed thing. I was going to say as a positive learning from SACS, but I suppose in a sense it was, that kind of ability to be in the corridors of power, but at the same time to be skeptical of them. And yeah, it's a perverse form of the education. It's not an unintended form, but I suppose that's what I learned from my schooling. If I take it through the whole 12 years, I mean, there are those who would have said, "Well, stuff this." I mean, I'm not going anywhere near it. And I was wondering about that actually, because the kind of excitement that this has generated. I was wondering, well, which group is this? Is this the group that rose from SACS in a sense, or the group that felt alienated? And I mean, I count myself as alienated, but my alienation it was tempered by the fact that I came from a place of privilege, also in background. So I don't feel lucky about having been at SACS, though. Having said all of that, I think I could have done but I don't know where else. Okay, so I mean, I had some friends. So when I started getting involved in sort of progressive politics, some of the other whites who I encountered came from Westerford. I don't think I can think of one who came from SACS. There was a guy called Mike Bakuski. Well, there were a couple of, what was it then? The Progressive Party people, the kind of white liberal opposition. But I got involved in something called National Youth Action, which was like a baby new SACS. And that would have been in Standard 9. And that was where I suddenly encountered non-racial, I encountered black, white, whatever, talking like serious politics, anti-apartheid politics. That was really, really exciting. I mean, I felt completely at sea. Didn't know what the hell, I didn't know what was going on. It was the time of black consciousness. There were big divisions, and eventually there was a bit of a split. But when I got elected onto a Western Cape executive, which out of nowhere and having done nothing, I mean, again, I was a complete novice. I was learning new things all the time. Compared to the black students in particular, who had already been politically involved in some or other way. But I suppose again that was an expression of the comfort with authority, although I didn't feel very comfortable. I felt totally uncomfortable. I'd come from surfing, and with my surfboard, and I wore sunglasses, so I didn't have to display my looks because I was so uncertain. And I'd land up at the Christian Institute where the meeting was on a Sunday afternoon. I'd come from, I'd start off in Komiki, and then I'd catch the train through, and then I'd get off at Mowbray, I think, Christian Institute. I go to this meeting, so I was like, surfer meets politics kind of situation. But that's where I was going. And then, of course, the next year, which was I think it was the second week of matric, I had my surfing accident. So that was me out, gone. Didn't finish at SACS. And I used to say to that's the one good thing about it was that I got out of SACS. I went to Abbott's College because I was, after I was in a wheelchair, I was feeling cuck, I was depressed and stuff, and I just felt going back to SACS is the last thing I'm going to do. It's a place where they treat you. I feel like I've gone through hell and back, and a bit like the army, because you go into a big ward in a public hospital and you spend 9 months there. You're with every kind of person, and actually, given the nature of big accidents where you're going to break your neck or your spine, most were working class white. Of course, the black spinal cord, they were in different wards, it being apartheid. So there I was in the ward, and a couple of the guys from the National Youth Action, Farid Esak was one, came to visit me, and they weren't allowed in, apartheid times. So I learned a lot about apartheid, in all of that, through all of that. And ultimately landed up, politically involved. But, so I wanted to go to a place that would treat one as an adult, not as a kind of regimented kid, which is what SACS was about. So I missed the matric year, which I think I kind of get a sense from some of the emails it was almost the kind of the year of strongest memories. And perhaps it was the year in which teachers treated pupils in a more adult-like fashion.
At the end of Standard 9, there was a massive exodus to Abbott's, and some to Progress and some to Cape Tut. We went down from 4 Standard 9 classes to 3 matric classes. That's how many guys left.
Really?
Because the exodus was almost all, you were in D1, yeah?
Yeah.
You would probably be the only guy from D1 who didn't come back in matric, but for a different reason. But all of D1 was there because it was working for them. But so the exodus came from D2, 3, and 4. And they only had 2, and I was in D4 and I went to E3. And E3 had 19 guys in the class.
Wow.
The school got a huge scruck when that happened, especially a lot of the teachers. It really was a kick up the arse for that to happen. And I was kind of aware of it at the time, but now going and piecing it all together, this thing has emerged as a thing. It was a big thing. And I think that changed the attitude of the teachers, as you just identified, not because we were now growing up, but because we were still there.
It's stuck. That's amazing. I didn't know that at all. I mean, and it was so, I mean, Abbott's, so I would have missed them because I was in hospital that year, but Abbott's was a completely different experience, and in two ways. I mean, the one is that we were treated more or less as adults. It was amazing. You had a common room. I mean, you came dressed in whatever, no uniforms. A lot of my buddies there were the kind of dropouts from the SACSs of the world. And I really kind of enjoyed that. I felt much more at home in that milieu. The teaching on the other was really interesting because it was more honest than SACS because it was totally geared to getting you through the exams. It was terrible. I mean, it was rote learning of the worst sort, but it was unapologetic about that because the reason why parents sent their kids there was maybe they're struggling at school. We want them to get a matric. And so, you studied endlessly the exam questions of the previous like 5 years or whatever. You knew that 60% of the questions you get are going to be old questions. There'll be some new ones, but if you'd learn the old ones, all of this stuff, which was totally offensive to my sense of what learning was going to be about. But it was honest. It had the virtue of being honest. Relatively small classes, boring, but there you go. I mean, that's what this education system is about. And then it had this other side to it. So it's kind of interesting as a contrast to SACS in that way.
And then, invariably you'd get them. I'm not so sure that I'd learned nothing by that method, though. I think it was, in my case, it was quite successful because well, anyway, maybe it's just an excuse I told myself, but it was as focusing on the key things, you know what I mean? So anyway, interesting.
Yeah. But what I wanted is going back to the authority and power thing. So I'll tell you a story that epitomized this for me was some of us used to go over. Well, I mean, some of us were allowed to go home for lunch break because we lived within walking distance, right? So I used to do that a lot. And Graham Belair's lived opposite me. And occasionally a couple of us would go and spend lunch at his place because he also was able to go home for lunch. And some of us took to smoking cigarettes at lunchtime in his place. Graham, I don't think, was ever a cigarette smoker, but some of the others of us were. And there was one guy who, if you remember, at the end of Standard 9, the new prefects were announced for the following year. And one of them was one of us, the buddies. And I mean, this guy wasn't a close friend of mine. But anyway, there we were smoking cigarettes, and you could see through the curtain. It was a ground floor flat. You could see through the curtain the street, and you could see those kids who were coming back to the school at lunchtime, who didn't have permission, who'd gone down to one of the cafes down the road. And I don't know whether I think this was probably in one of the first week or two of matric before I had my accident. And we're sitting there, and this guy who's a prefect now, a new prefect, and he's also having a smoke, leaves his cigarettes in the ashtray, goes out on the stoop, and grabs the guy and says, "You don't have permission to be out at lunchtime. Come and see me after school." Now that sort of duplicity of like you're inside the flat, smoking a cigarette, breaking all the rules, but you go out and exert this totally unnecessary authority over this poor guy that you can see through the curtain. I mean, that just sucked. So that's what I saw was the way prefect system was designed to pull a certain layer of us into the orbit of authority and turn them into like small, like the indunas, the kind of the boss boys, the guys who got roots, who can see what's going on, who can surveil the student population and like basically exert authority and a kind of arbitrary power actually. So that's just to put the cherry on the top of the way this system works. Yeah, and I remember saying I think it was in Standard 9, to one of our classmates, and I won't name it, just how revolting I found Whiteford's behavior. I said something like, "What a terrible head, he's just a terrible headmaster." And this guy was, he was a rebellious guy in class. I mean, he wasn't like, and he said, "Oh, do you think so? I mean, I think he's quite good." And that's that kind of thing where you falling foul of authority, but you still accept or see it as a kind of you can't really imagine an alternative. This is how headmasters are, and he's pretty good actually. And there's a kind of interesting set of things going on there that, yeah, that's interesting. That is very interesting because, I mean, you could see how I mean, it was almost like he was cultivating a kind of detached, and maybe he sort of was more hands-on in those younger, earlier days. But it was almost like he was cultivating. My overriding image of him is him perched on what I don't know what you call that sort of stick with a seat on the top
Shooting.
umpiring cricket game. Yeah, um, that's a test of privilege. If you know that that's a shooting stick, right? Um, sort of perched on one of those, umpiring a cricket game or something, and that's the sort of detached kind of Arcadian view of the school, the big sports field and the school and I mean, that said, the grounds are extraordinary. I mean, the buildings, there's sort of a whole lot of when you see the most schools in this country. Uh, I mean, and also including like more ordinary suburban school, but township schools and I mean those sports facilities at SACS is interesting because I mean I think that you can be aware of your privilege, but its manifestations escape you some of the time. It's not like you become instantly aware of every instance in which your privilege is playing a role. It's so deeply ingrained.
Yeah.
So you can think that you're very humble, and maybe in a certain situation you are, and then in another situation you behave like in a terrible way because. So I think that there remains a degree of unconsciousness about it.
Mm,
But
mm,
that is really, really interesting because, of course, the image here of South Africans abroad is that, you know, we're so good at what we do. People just want us. People love us because we like smart. And this country can't provide us, can't keep us because you're not good enough here. And of course, I mean, South Africa is going down the tubes at the moment. I've got no that's a whole another story, which I will talk about a bit at the dinner. But there's just a sense that we, especially, and the we is like mostly as white South Africa, is we are wanted by the world. We kind of can be an entrepreneur everywhere, but South Africa won't recognize us, which is another complaint, another form of entitlement, I suppose. I said that my friends at SACS were mostly the people that I was friends with outside and before, like in my streets. And then I remembered that I was doing a great injustice to my friendship with Charlie Simpson and Perry Norgard, who I was surfing with. And actually at the point when I had my accident, I mean, in my last couple of years at SACS, they would have been probably, I'm sure the friends that I spent most time, because we used to surf a lot together. I was diagnosed when I was about 13 or 14, I think, with hyper hyperthyroid, which was so I was just burning up energy at a huge rate, which so I was eating and getting thin. Um, so they put me on I went on to a medication, and that slowly sort of sorted itself out. The other thing is that I met someone who I don't want to name because I did suggest to him that he might be interested in talking to you, but I don't think he's going to do it. And he's one of the guys who left at the end of Standard 9. In fact, he failed at the end of Standard 9, and he went to Abbott's, I think, or Tuts. I can't remember. And he, I mean, he just said, that's SACS. He said to his mother, if he stays at SACS, he's just going to fail again. He cannot cope with this place. But he made an interesting comment in relation to that story about privilege that we were discussing, because he said that he thinks SACS messed up his ability to work in the corporate environment. He said as soon as he found himself in the corporate environment, it just reminded him of SACS so much, of school, which he loathed, so much, and felt so alienated from, that he just couldn't cope. He felt like an alien. Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Together, and hangouts and stuff. So, and of course, Charlie lived around the corner from me. Uh, but they weren't. We never hung out at SACS. We never. I don't know if we ever even saw each other at SACS. Uh, so it's been a bit of a mystery to me. I've been trying to think about, like, well, was I just like a super lonely kid at SACS, just into my own things, and with friends outside? I don't know. Anyway, that I did want to remember, like, Charlie and Perry being my buddies while I was at SACS. I reckon there's probably dozens of them, and I reckon they're probably the ones who are least likely to come to the reunion, because what the hell do they want to be back there for? Now, I mean, the thing is that for me, that I'm trying to think back, to them, and I think I was so busy being hostile, let's say, being antagonistic, to this, system, this set of institutional rules and assumptions that came with being at SACS. Like, now when you say that the boss said, you are the leaders of tomorrow, I can't recall ever hearing that. You know what I mean? I don't, in a way, I didn't hear it. I mean, I did hear it, obviously, but also I didn't hear it. And, but I mean, I fully understand that that was what we were being inducted into. I mean, there's no question about that. But the explicitness of it that you are recalling, I don't really feel like I recall. And so I'm trying to, from that, extrapolate to what my own experiences were with authority and the corridors of power in the earlier years. Because again, I was opposing, I mean, I was explicitly, more and more explicitly, setting myself up to oppose that power and those assumptions. And as I took on that identity more and more strongly, obviously I saw things in some ways more clearly, but also you kind of position yourself, no doubt, in a way that was extremely irritating to many people around me. I was probably a little prick, sort of lecturing them on Marxism and shit like that. But I think I did have a discomfort with those, a complex relationship at any rate with those corridors of power, like a kind of a discomfort with them, but probably in another way and at another level, a certain confidence and ease with them, which also came from my family background. I mean, not so much my mother, but who was also quite alienated from the family tradition, but from prior to my grandmother and so on, and the kind of 1820s settler, very self-consciously 1820s settler tradition, and all the assumptions about being, the offspring of Sir Richard Southey or something like that. Kind of, it was all kind of there in the oxygen, I suppose. Um, so when you talk about, your experience in Australia and a middle class milieu, and you feeling slightly uncomfortable there, and like, I can identify with that. So it's quite kind of mixed. I mean, certainly later I became very confident in the corridors of power, but then it was more like those corridors. They were my guys. They were the guys who won, in the end. Until I became very, very, very uncomfortable with them. I mean, what's happening now in South Africa is deeply distressing. So, and I saw the rapidity with which the corridors of power became very exclusive and insulated from everybody else, which is what it is now. So I've seen all of that stuff, but I just think I think I was quite awkward and quite, partly uncertain, partly antagonistic, whatever. So my relationship to the whole thing was kind of quite complicated, and there's these different ways. So so you can be comfortable with being antagonistic within a certain frame, but like workers who are not party to that power structure, when they're on strike or something, their way of relating to power is very, very, and they've got a way of relating to it, but their way of relating to power is one of collective force and reinforcing themselves. So I remember in the early days of the trade unions where they started to, win the right to negotiate. And of course, both management and unions were trying to explore how did this work? How did they proceed? And what would happen was the bosses would lay on like a meal at lunchtime for the work, for the workers as well, like in the boardroom where they negotiate. And in the early days, they used to, on principle, refuse to eat anything and go outside and have their lunch outside in the street because they didn't want to be co-opted. They didn't want to owe anything to the boss because that would be giving away something in the negotiation. You had to preserve your integrity and your autonomy. And I mean, so I had the same, and this is part of what I was talking to David Attrell about that bring into my talk on that Saturday is going to be about my experience with the students' uprisings, the fees must fall people in 2015, 2016, because I was the academic on campus, one of them who has been linked up to popular struggle in a way that most others haven't, and I mean, again, a deep bloody skepticism about authority in the university. I mean, talk about an institute. It's the same as SACS. It's a kind of institution. It's a ruling class institution. So the fallists were young, black, very aspirantly middle class. A lot of them very poor and from very poor backgrounds, but they were at university to become middle class. That's where they wanted to go. But very, very frustrated by the university culture and by some of the literature and by the financial burdens that they had to carry, which were huge, as well as very demanding courses and so. And so it started off as a revolt against the colonial nature of the university institute. And the kind of demand was to decolonize the university, decolonize the curriculum. So at a certain point, the institute, I was running a research institute, and we worked with unions and communities and all kinds of things. So, I went to a meeting of the students and I offered, we had funding for it. We'd actually, spoken to a couple of our funders for them to write a book about produce a book with their stories, with their aims, about the struggles they were waging, but that it would be their project, and we would support it and we would fund. And they were very hostile, and they said, you are an unreconstructed white colonial professor, and this is what we find. So you arrogant, you this, you that, whatever. And I thought, okay, I've been in negotiations before. I mean, that's okay. And I mean, it took 3 months or so to actually work through the issues and reach an accommodation. But they were drawing attention to exactly the point that you've made, that you're very confident in coming into this meeting and addressing us. I mean, they didn't put it into those words, but that's what they were reacting to. And that I could remain in some senses untouched person by their critique of me as an unreconstructed white. Wah. I didn't like keel over and say, stop fucking insulting me and I'm leaving now. That would have been pathetic. So it was just interesting the way they were seeing the privilege that is like totally integral to who I am in South Africa, and saying, don't come in here thinking that you spend. And they were very skeptical about the COSATU links. They said, COSATU is part of the ANC, and the ANC is what we fight. So I had to explain that the ANC was not going to censor their book. Anyway, I mean, that's just a story about privilege and how it works.
That's a lovely story. I love it. Karl,
well, it's kind of interesting, but I think it's it's not entirely resolved for me, and the nature of this sort of situation where students are there for a short period of time and then they leave means that you can't carry on. It's a conversation that reaches a certain point. But I think that I think that what happened in the process over 3 months is that they had to first tear strips off me.
Mm.
They had to say what they wanted to say. They had to force me to hear them.
Mm-hmm.
And there were amazing moments where I said something that I thought meant X, and they heard it as Y. It was like a completely, well, it was like where I thought I was. So I said to them, you don't have to accept this offer. You can do something online. You don't need a publication which takes money and resources, etc., etc. So if actually, because like when one of the, several of them were saying they just don't trust, so they can't trust me. So I said, if it's too hard to work with me, you can walk away from me, and that's okay. I thought I was being honest. I thought I was I was laying out the limits of what I was offering, and that it wasn't essential to their purpose. They hadn't come to us and said they want to do a book. We'd gone to them. I'd gone to them and said, and what they heard was me saying, well, if you don't like it, I'm taking it away. They heard a threat. You know what I mean? It's like, and I thought I was bending over backward to say, this is, you have control and you have agency here. But they heard threat. And there were several incidents like, yeah. So anyway, it went through this process where we reached an understanding about the control of this thing, because I had thought that we needed to have certain kinds of inputs and control. They didn't want any of that. They were very alive to the way controlling the text, like editing it, is a political function. And if they give me that power to edit it for language, it'll be, where does it end? To what extent do I interfere with what they're trying to articulate? And to what extent is the language they use part of what they're trying to articulate? So they pushed me back on that. And I said, fine, that's, I can live with all of that. The only thing I'm going to need to, as a final kind of control over it is if you, for example, end with a rallying cry to go and burn down the VC's house. We can't be party with our funders to that sort of call. I was just trying to give an example. So we agreed on that, and we wrote a little contract and stuff. And once that was done, the relationship shifted completely. They invited me to come to all of their meetings. There was a certain crisis moment where they got into a big fight at a lodge where they were on a writing retreat, writing this. They got into a fight with the management. And they then came to me and said, we need to report to you. This is what happened. I already knew because this message had come to the VC, and I mean, it was a shambles. But, we strategized together. So it was like they needed to get through this process with me to a point where they could trust, what I was doing and their own agency in it. So it reached a certain kind of a resolution, which was really interesting, I thought. But I'm not so stupid, yeah, I'm good. It's also, I'm not, it also showed me that this is something that you have to be dealing with your whole life. It's not something that you just been there, done that. Now I can move on and be accepted. Yeah, it's a continuous process. I did my undergraduate degree, obviously, at UCT, and then I went and taught literacy and stuff. Worked with unions a little bit, and then I went up to Joburg because I wanted to get closer to the politics. So I wanted to get out of Cape Town, and I went to Wits and did my honors.
When?
And then that was 86, 86, 87. And then I went and worked for the Labour Bulletin. Let me just send a message here. Then I went and worked for the Labour Bulletin, which was a kind of Labour-linked journal. It's an interface between academia and Labour movement. And then I started working with Kasatu on the future after the transition, future of labor and stuff like that. And then I went back to Wits and did a PhD, and then I went back to Naledi, which was the Kasatu policy sort of and research, and worked there for about 8 years or something, 6 years, something like that. And then I went to WITS 2007 on staff. But I went then to a labor research unit, which is with a guy who'd supervised my PhD and stuff. Was people I carried on working with them. They were in the labor field. They were path breaking. He was the professor who sort of invented industrial sociology in South Africa, and he retired in. Anyway, I took it over. I became the director in 2011, and uh, carried on there. So my academic career has not been that long. I've been in and out of it through doing degrees at various points and remaining close to the university, but it was much more intense from 2007. Uh, and I got fully into it, and it became a place to reflect on all the puzzles of our transition. I mean, which I just mentioned a few minutes ago about what's happened in the corridors of power. Uh, I did a big project on Barrow Hospital. This is all the stuff I'm going to talk about on
I got a
Saturday
question.
nights, and I don't know
I've
if
got a
they're going to
question.
record.
I got
Yeah, the unions became increasingly, close to the ANC, UDF and ANC and popular struggle. And initially that was also built on the same kind of culture. But I think that became the proximity again to power. And what happened in the already the unions had become bigger and more bureaucratic and sort of more differentiated between those making high level political policy positions and the rank and file on the shop floor. So there was a kind of a scale and a kind of as the unions became more central to everything, they were faced with more and more kind of complex policy and political decisions. It was no longer so simple as just like fighting to negotiate with the boss in a particular factory. So I think that led to these different trajectories within the union movement, and then the closeness to the ANC, which became in turn closeness to government, and it became a way that unionists, a kind of upward mobility, they could go on, they could become MPs, and I mean an MP, the salary, and then they could become a minister even, and et cetera, became almost like has a kind of corrupting influence.
fearful.
And then I've also exactly. I mean, it raises a question that's not it's a constant tension in trade unionism, in radical trade unionism around the world. It's like how you deal with what happens as you engage with power is you become more and more compromised by it. And it's more and more complicated to traverse this terrain, and there's more and more opportunities. And then the other thing that I became, because of work I've been doing now, I went back and looked at some of my PhD stuff and thought about it again. And what's so clear is how on the cusp of the transition, how people were positioning themselves around opportunities for upward mobility. And whether that was in the plants, so shop stewards becoming managers, um, or getting little businesses, outsourced businesses, that the company was setting up. And so shop steward is becoming a route into something else. And then and others looking at politics, and that was meant the ANC. Like you had to be senior in the ANC branch, and then you might get to be a councillor, or you might get even more senior and go on to the region and go on, et cetera, et cetera. And it became, this was something as a white, ostensibly a white radical from outside, we didn't see or understand. But I've got people talking about it, how they are telling me about how difficult it was to operate in the shop steward committee because of this thing that people were wanting to move on, and they battle to hold the ANC branch and control it, but they couldn't. And then their own comrades were going into the ANC, but they were positioning themselves there for. And you started to realize how broad and deep this aspiration to move upwards in society was. And then it's not a puzzle, actually. If you think about 300 years of apartheid, which well, it wasn't 300 years of apartheid, but apartheid as the last stretch really did everything to strip away opportunity for any kind of upward mobility, business formation, opportunities like that, education, everything was systematically kind of stripped away. And then it's not like a puzzle. Why this would be the most important thing for people and also for people who, and I think it explains a lot about South Africa today, because people who didn't have the education, didn't have the skills, didn't have the experience for obvious reasons, but nonetheless this burning ambition to become wealthy, to rise up, to get a better job today and a better one tomorrow, and it fostered a kind of culture of which has been incredibly destructive, but not very easy to see how you could do that differently given that history. So that's that's the short version. Yeah, Viti, I'm now a pensioner, so I don't have to respond to it. I can go to the beach. Yeah, I'm privileged. I can go to the beach. I mean, fuck it, I can put solar panels on my roof. Yeah, well, semi-retired. I'm trying to extract myself from various things. I've got some other stuff I want to do, other kinds of writing, but so I can afford solar power. Within 4 weeks, I should probably not suffer from load shedding. So, and that's good for the planet. I'm doing my good deed, but yarra, where did that come from? Probably goes right back to those 1820 settlers and their farm, which they stole. So, no, look, I don't know, and that's the problem with this talk on that is exactly. I mean, the way I see it, the stuff that I'm writing at the moment is I don't think that there's a way out of where we are now for another 30 years or so. I think it's going to be new Firstly, the ANC itself has to implode because it occupies the space in South Africa, the political space, which is where something new has to come from. And while it occupies it, that new thing can't emerge. And it's really interesting. The students were looking for other discourses. They were looking to BC and to the black movements in the US, and they were looking elsewhere to try and find a language that was different from the ANC. And so I really do think it has to implode, and that space. But that's that's not going to just happen tomorrow, unfortunately. Well, when it does happen, it's going to be chaos as well. And Kgalema Motlanthe, he's a good guy. He was the president for about a year before Zuma. He was like an interim president. And he's become a really important figure, kind of with a gravitas and a history and a critique. And he said recently that the political parties or forces, or I can't remember what term he used, that are going to take us into the future do not yet exist. And I think that's right. And I think that's time, and a new generation that doesn't carry the same burden as the current generation of leadership. So it's a difficult space, and it's not an encouraging one and to speak to the SACS old, the old classmates, because I don't want to, I can't hold out a false hope, and I can't, and I'm someone who feels if you take a historical perspective, you understand that sometimes you've got to live through 30 years of paralysis, and it's happened before in history, and it looks like that's our fate now. I mean, and of course I may be wrong, but it doesn't help people who want their kids to go overseas, and it's because they don't think the future is worth. I mean, the future doesn't look particularly good, I don't think. But then citizens, and those are business people, farmers, I don't know, people who live in wherever. People are making their own plans, and there's quite a lot of interesting kind of actual working together of black and white in small towns, and to just try and fix the potholes in the roads, or the water, or the whatever it is, So I think those are maybe the sorts of places that one's going to be looking. I do think that the world is in for turmoil over the next period as well, with the kind of rise of China, decline of the US, like EU, right? There's just so much struggle over who who's gonna dominate the world order, sort of where with the US can't carry on being the dominant power. If I was looking for if the question of like where would I advise someone's kids to go, it's not so clear.
No.
Brexit, England, New Zealand, out there, like in the middle of nowhere. Um,
Yeah.
the US with Trump hovering, it's not. So just to circle back to the NYA, National Youth Action. I don't know anything more of what I saw when I went, and I don't even know how I heard about it because that's what you asked me, and I can't think who it was because I don't know anyone at SACS who participated. I thought Mike Barkuski, but then I went and Googled him, and he was at Herzliya. So he's a Green MP in Canada now. So he was in the NYA. He was a big guy there. But what it was a black and white movement, a little bit like NewSAS, but for school kids. I don't know how it was set up. I don't think it was quite ephemeral. I don't think it lasted long. But I went to the annual general meeting or whatever, annual congress or whatever it was. And I think that it was in the summer of 71, 72, because I had my accident beginning of 73. So I think it was then. And I was a complete novice. And what consumed that meeting was a push by the radical black students to break away along the same lines as SASO broke away from NewSAS. It was exactly the same debate. It was, we can't, mess around with white liberalism. We need to go out on our own. We need to be autonomous, all of that stuff. And so I was, I just found myself in the middle of this like huge fight that I didn't understand. But I was totally fascinated by it. And there was a guy called Farid Essak, who's a very prominent guy, theologian, a Muslim theologian in South Africa now. And we became friendly. And he was a leading figure among the students, the black students, who was trying to hold them together, actually. He was a kind of voice of reconciliation. And then there must have been I don't know, there must have been some other gathering where the Western Cape executive was selected or elected or been established. Maybe it was right at the beginning. So maybe it was being established. And I got onto that executive and so I must have spent a year there, and we were working towards a big fundraising event. And then I had my accident, and I think NYA collapsed very soon after that. I think it was split apart in the same way as the new SASO. So, and then I see that COSAS actually was formed, the Congress of South African Students was formed in 79, which was a few years later. And I do find myself wondering whether there was any precursor to that came out of NYA. But I don't know. It's a history that needs to be uncovered. And I'm going to speak to a historian friend of mine who's working on COSAS and see if he can find out anything. But anyway, that's it. So it was just this little crucible of the same debates around black consciousness and radical liberalism, which was interesting. Yeah.